This week in Britain, we've had the UK Foreign Secretary, a bloke called Jeremy Hunt, and the guy who wants to be the next Prime Minister of Britain. God help us, mind you, God help us with all of them that are standing. And this is an article on davidicke.com this week by Kathleen Johnson, just some great stuff. And she writes, British Foreign Secretary Jeremy Hunt has just given a speech extolling the virtues of a free media. Because, like I say, the media must be free, according to these system servers, to tell the public what the system wants them to believe. But of course it mustn't be free to tell them otherwise. So when they talk about we must protect press freedom, what it means is we must protect the freedom of the press to tell people what we want them to believe. So British Foreign Secretary Jeremy Hunt has just given a speech extolling the virtues of a free media, praising the journalists who've been brave enough to expose the truth about wicked governments in the face of tyrannical oppression, brackets, except Julian Assange, as she goes on to point out. While he was preparing to give his speech without any indication of any self-reflection at all, these people have no self-awareness, let alone reflection, he defended the torture of WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange. After news broke that UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, Nils Melzer, had found that Julian Assange had been the victim of psychological torture for years, Hunt, who is gunning to become the UK's next Prime Minister, accused him of interfering in British affairs and making inflammatory statements. But intervening in the affairs of other countries by bombing the innocent, that's okay. This is wrong, Hunt tweeted. Assange chose to hide in the embassy and was always free to leave and face justice. The UN Special Rapporteur should allow British courts to make their judgments without his interference or inflammatory accusations. With all due respect, sir, Mr. Assange was about as free to leave as someone sitting on a rubber boat in a shark pool, Melzer replied. As detailed in my formal letter to you so far, UK courts have not shown the impartiality and objectivity required by the rule of law. Now, of course, Jeremy Hunt was speaking, and therefore what he said was disingenuous. This is another cause and effect. The reason Assange, and I have no brief for Assange as a person, I don't know him. It's the principle that I'm talking about, the principle of freedom. And the reason Assange went to the Ecuadorian embassy to avoid so-called British justice, and it is so-called, was because of his concern that if he was arrested for an alleged crime out of Sweden, etc., then he would, once in custody, be subject to an extradition order to be extradited to the United States, where they would throw every book they possibly could at him in a show trial to say, this is what happens if you take us on. And of course, since he was taken from the embassy by force on this say-so of the disgusting new Ecuadorian leader who replaced the man who allowed asylum for Assange, then everything Assange and his lawyers were concerned about has happened. And suddenly a Swedish case against him that had been dropped is suddenly resurrected. So now there is an extradition request to the United States by Assange, on Assange, and also through this case in Sweden, there's an alternative way of getting him to the United States if necessary. And this whole idea of facing British justice, when Assange was manhandled out of the embassy by British police, who were allowed to go into what is Ecuadorian sovereign land, according to diplomatic protocol, by this Lenin guy, well named, current leader in Ecuador, he went before a judge who should be, throughout the legal process, completely impartial. And all he had to do, this judge, was to rubber stamp the holding in custody of Assange. Instead, he launches into a personal character assassination on Assange from his bench. And we're supposed to believe, with that start alone, that Assange is going to have justice handed out to him. It is outrageous. And what's happening as this totalitarian state, globally and in its various national forms, gets more and more blatant because it's becoming more and more part of life as they transform society. As this continues, we're going to see more and more of these things. And here's Jeremy Hunt again. Jeremy Hunt says he would not block WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange from being extradited to the US if he became Prime Minister. Well, God forbid on many levels that Jeremy Hunt becomes Prime Minister, but what he's articulating there is government policy. The plan all along has been to get Assange out of the Ecuadorian embassy, brackets achieved, and then extradite him to the United States for publishing material that no one has denied is factually true, and that exposed blatant war crimes and cold-blooded murder by American troops in places like Afghanistan. The Foreign Secretary has said a government he led would not block Julian Assange's extradition to the USA, while the WikiLeaks founder faces the prospect of dying in jail if found guilty of espionage. That's what they want. And Assange has been attacked, condemned, and his fate cheered by the mainstream media overwhelmingly for doing the job they should have been doing. And these latest charges against Assange by the American Gestapo have suddenly alerted some in the mainstream media to the implications for them of someone being charged in the way that they are now charging Assange, in the sense that they are charging him with essentially publishing so-called classified information that happens to be true. And for classified, read what we don't want people to know about. And they're now realizing that actually when we rarely publish things that the government doesn't like, well, these charges mean that we could be charged with the same thing. Oh, it might affect me. It's outrageous. But Assange? Oh, well, no, don't bother about him. Here's another story, again by Kathleen Johnson. She writes some really great stuff on davidicke.com. BBC Sky News have hidden their interviews with UN expert on the torture of Assange. UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, Nils Melzer, has said that on the 31st of May he gave video interviews with both Sky News and the BBC on his findings that WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange is the victim of psychological torture. As of this writing, footage of those interviews is nowhere to be found. In response to a smear by virulent empire propagandist Idris Ahmed about his conducting an interview with RT, Melzer tweeted that he has given interviews to both Sky News and BBC World, but that they seem not to have been aired. So the UN rapporteur actually appeared on the Kremlin's premier propaganda network. Yes, the propaganda network of the state that shoots journalists in the face to discuss Julian Assange's torture, tweeted Ahmad, pretending to be under the illusion that UN experts are meant to remain exclusively loyal to a specific group of nations. For the record, on May the 1st, I've also given similar exclusive TV interviews to both Sky News and BBC World on Julian Assange, but it seems they decided not to broadcast them, Melzer responded. Indeed, there is, as of this writing, no video footage to be found anywhere of Melzer's interviews with either of these outlets. If you search for online video footage of Nils Melzer conducting interviews on the subject, you'll find videos from RT and Rupli, which is a Russian RT-connected news agency and news footage agency. You'll find his excellent interview on Democracy Now!, but you won't find videos from BBC World or Sky News, nor any record of any video interviews ever being heard. So it appears, she writes, that these interviews were never aired at all, or if they were aired, have had any record of them hidden from easy online visibility. In any case, this is a big deal. The BBC published one print article that contains a few small excerpts from a discussion with Melzer, but in terms of impact and quantity of information, this comes nowhere close to a televised interview and online video footage. So, this is what the censorship online by your YouTubes and your Facebooks and your Twitters and your Apples and your other like organizations is defending. This is what it calls legitimate news sources, while it calls that which tells the truth fake news. People say I talk about some weird stuff, some far out stuff. But how about that chair that you're sitting in isn't solid? How weird is that? This reality is nothing like we think it is.
When I saw what Icke is doing, I was a bit jealous on him. Wow, look at what this guy's doing.
I don't know if anybody else could do it but him, actually.
We are in a period now where speaking your truth is not just important, it's utterly crucial to where humanity goes from here. The world needs renegades.